Jeremy's War, Chapter 19. We carried his body down the hill, the musket balls whistling over our heads. The weight of him strained at my shoulders, and my sweat mixed with my tears. He's dead. He's dead. Once we were back behind the fence, several officers gathered around him. One placed a mirror above his mouth. If it steamed, that would be a sign Brock was breathing. But another officer pushed the mirror away. There was no hope. One of the militia commanders began ordering us to form up again. His name was McDonnell, and with Brock dead, he was now senior officer. "We'll attack again," he shouted, walking up and down the line. "We'll avenge the general." I didn't care if we attacked. If we attacked again, we'd probably die. I didn't care if we all died. A hand gently touched my arm. "Not you, lad. You stay with the general." A young officer looked down at me gravely. "That's your duty now." "Form your line!" McDonnell had taken his horse over the fence. He swung himself into the saddle and pulled out his sword. "Forward, men!" he cried. "Remember the general! Remember General Brock!" But no more than 50 men leaped over the fence to join him. The rest stayed where they were, wounded, exhausted, defeated. The small, ragged line advanced up the hill behind the colonel, stepping over the bodies of their own men. Before they got halfway, the Americans opened fire. McDonnell's horse screamed and fell. Then McDonnell collapsed. The line wavered and broke. Men began to run back towards the fence. The British officers had no more stomach for assaults. We were pulled back to the rear of the village. 3 of us carried Brock into a stone house, then left him to find Alfred. He would be worried about Alfred. The horse was standing outside the house, motionless, staring silently at the door. I tethered him behind the house, out of danger. It was the last thing I was able to do on my own. I slid down the wall beside the horse and closed my eyes. I was empty. Brock is dead. No. Yes. He fell. You saw him. You carried him. No, I didn't. It was a mistake. You saw him fall. He's dead. I sat in the mud, my back against the wall. Men around me wept and cursed the Yankees and swore revenge. But I didn't hear them. Everyone's dead. We're all going to be dead. I want to be dead. The battle was lost. The Americans were sending troops across the river, reinforcing their position on the heights. Most of our cannon had been knocked out of action. We were pinned in the village, too few to attack. Any time now, the Yankees would pour down into the village, and some of us would surrender, and the rest of us would die. "Form up! We're moving out!" Officers were among us, rousing the men. Were we going to attack again? Was I to die on the hill like Brock? But we weren't going to attack. We were leaving the village, going beyond the range of the cannon. Before long, we were in the bush behind the town, marching west up a steep hill. It seemed strange. Fort George was to the north. Why weren't we going back to Fort George? I didn't care. March me anywhere. Let me fight. Brock is dead. But the sight when we came out of the bush woke me up. Hundreds of British troops, scarlet uniforms row on row, stood in a plowed field. Flags snapped in the breeze. Officers on horses galloped about shouting orders. The reinforcements from Chippewa and Fort George had arrived, but whoever was replacing Brock had decided to keep away from the village. He was preparing his attack in safety, waiting until everything was in place. Brock would never have been so cautious. Beside them were rows of militia, the men wearing whatever they threw on when word came of the attack. Their faces were grim, hard. They'd heard of Brock's death. He was their general too, and they wanted blood. We fell into the line near one end. Everyone seemed to think I was another private, part of the 49th Regiment. I let them think that. Behind us, on a great black horse, sat a British general, Sheaffe. I had seen him at Fort George. People said he was conservative, by the book, the opposite of Brock. For 2 hours we waited. Sheaffe was massing every troop he could find, waiting until the last reinforcements arrived before attacking, forming his lines in perfect order, by the book. "Let's get on with it," someone muttered. Sheaffe continued to wait. But there was no need to hurry. From the bush surrounding the Yankees came howls and screams and musket shot. The Mohawk. I imagined the Yankee soldiers listening to the war cries in the bush. What were those sounds doing to them? What were they thinking? I was sure that the longer we waited, the more frightened the Yankees would be. "Fix bayonets!" At last, Sheaffe was ready to attack. There were almost 1,000 of us, but who could know how many Americans had poured across the river in the hours since Brock's death? Well, we'd find out soon. "Forward!" We marched across the fields, the Mohawk running from the bush to join our flank. On the far side, we could see the Yankees. I'd expected more of them. They'd had hours to reinforce, but there were no more than a couple hundred dug in behind piles of earth. They had wasted their time. We marched forward steadily, our boots sinking into the wet earth of the fields, the drums beating out the pace. I wasn't sweating anymore. I clenched my musket in cold determination. They killed Brock. I wanted to reach them. I wanted to kill. For the first time in my life, I wanted to kill. Brock is dead. The Americans opened fire, but there were too few of them, and we were still too far away. Suddenly the Indians gave a great battle cry and rushed forward. In their hands they clenched muskets, in their belts tomahawks, eager for the scalps of the long knives. It was too much for the Yankees. Men began running away toward the cliff. I saw an officer waving his sword, shouting at the men to stand their ground, but he was pushed back by a wave of deserters. A group of them held their ground, maybe a few dozen at the most. Our line approached. I could see their faces, frightened of death, frightened of disgrace. "Attack with bayonets!" I plunged forward, my musket thrust out in front of me. In a moment we were at the earthworks. I leaped over them. There was a flash of blue, of steel. Without thinking, I thrust my musket at it. The bayonet sank into something soft, like sand. I froze. He was no older than I was. His eyes stared at me, his mouth open. Then he sank to the earth, my bayonet still in his chest, the blood soaking his shirt. My God! I yanked at the bayonet, pulled it out of him. He fell backward, sprawled on the ground, his eyes still wide open, dead. Suddenly I was vomiting, unable to stop. I bent over, retched again. Then I staggered away. No matter what happened, I couldn't stand to look at him again. The Americans who survived our charge were falling back. I rejoined the line, already at the top of the cliff. Below was chaos. The Indians were pouring down the hill, burying their hatchets into the skulls of every Yankee they reached. Some Americans had thrown themselves from the cliffs in panic. You could see their twisted bodies on the banks below. Others were trying to swim across the churning river. I saw one head disappear, then another. Dozens of men huddled on the bank by the river, many of them without muskets, waiting in terror for the Indians. An American officer marched up the hill, escorted by 2 militiamen. They brought him to Sheaffe. A minute later, the bugle sound ceased fire, but the Mohawks ignored the bugle. They had come to kill. Sheaffe himself had to beg their chief to stop before they reluctantly put their tomahawks back in their belts. I looked across the river. Thousands of Americans lined the shore, row on row of blue, silently watching their comrades surrender. Why hadn't they crossed? An Indian jumped on a rock and raised his arms. Head back, bare skin glistening in the rain, he screamed bloody defiance to the men across the river. A few swore back. Most turned away. The American Army of the Niagara, 8,000 strong, had refused to go into battle. They were frightened, poorly led, and terrified of being scalped. And then I knew. Brock didn't need to die. If he'd waited until the Indians arrived, he would have had his victory and still be alive. The charge up the hill had been a mistake. I covered my face with my hands. I had seen too much today. I had killed a man. I had seen men slaughtered. Brock, you died for nothing.